Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
You just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're going to lose. Coming down the stretch, you're going to lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, here to talk about MSU's upcoming road game against Minnesota Golden Gophers on Tuesday night. As we've seen so far in the Big Ten, there are no gimme road games, and Michigan State has only managed one road win so far in the Big Ten. So if the Spartans want to push for at least a double bye in the Big Ten tournament and a top four finish, this is exactly the kind of game they need to get. The Golden Gophers are 14-7 and 5-5, which is, I think, a lot better than we thought would they be at the turn, coming off a big overtime win versus Northwestern. They're 75th in KenPom and 93rd in net. On offense, they're 98th on offense and 57th on defense, which is not great, but a big improvement from last year, especially on the defensive end. Over the last three games, they've really gotten good. On offense, they do two things really well. They're 16th in the nation from two, and they're 81st in offensive rebounding. The struggles are via turnovers. They rank 236 in turnover percentage, and free throw percentage. We're only 68.2% from the line, and they don't get there very often either. And their threes are not great either at 33.8%. On defense, they've been pretty good against the twos at 39th and have a number 74 block percentage. They're not a very good defensive rebounding team at ranking 149th, and they don't turn over opponents very much, so they rank 203rd in turnovers generated. Mediocre against the three at 181st in percentage, but they limit attempts. And this sort of is similar to the story we had from Maryland, but not quite so much. So they're 11th in three-point attempts as percent overall shots from the floor, so they just don't give up a lot. And on defense, they also don't foul too much. And it's a slow team, which seems to be the case for a lot of teams in the Big Ten. They're 208th overall in pace and 238th in length of offensive possession. And again, this feels like we just did this show, which it wasn't too long ago that Michigan State faced Minnesota, except the difference then is Hawkins was not playing, so he'll be back for this game as far as I know.
Yeah, I watched their game yesterday against. We're recording this on Sunday. I watched it yesterday. Their win in overtime at home over Northwestern, and it really laid bare how much better this team is than they were a year ago. And, you know, you can point to a number of different things. You can point to the fact that some of their returning players like Garcia and Payne have continued to get better. You can point to the addition of three new guards, two in the portal, one as an incoming freshman, being vastly, vastly better than what they rolled out there last year. And those are all true statements. But I think, to me, the most obvious thing when you watch them, and this is, for as much as we utilize and believe in the value of what analytics tell you and statistics about a team, there's also, I believe there's also still room for the eye test in this sense. I saw someone who's a fairly prominent blogger, I'll use that now somewhat antiquated term, internet presence, let's say that, who covers another Big Ten team, say something yesterday on X, Twitter, about how the mantra about, well, a team playing hard as an explanation for things is a cliche, and it's it's not really very useful. And that's where I really disagree with him, because I think sometimes playing hard, playing aggressively, being tough is actually what underlies improved statistical performance. It does show up sooner or later. It's a real thing. To dismiss it, I think is, let's put it this way. If I put the way Minnesota generally plays their games for 40 minutes versus, let's just pick a random team, the University of Michigan. Are you going to honestly tell me that there's not a difference? And if if you compare these teams side by side in quote unquote talent, which is always a tortured term, but if we can agree that in a general sense, talent means a combination of athletic ability and skill sets, so the ability to handle and pass the ball, the ability to shoot it, those types of things, combined with athletic ability. Is there really a huge gap between Minnesota's roster and Michigan's? At least Michigan's full strength? I don't think so. But there's very definitely a gap in terms of the intensity and effort with which those teams play for 40 minutes of a game, and the physical toughness that they play with. Minnesota, to use a football term, Minnesota makes you feel them. We saw this in the game at Breslin. They come to play, and it's something that I give Ben Johnson credit for. He has not had overwhelming talent to work with. I don't think he's yet demonstrated that he's the guy to fix the long-standing recruiting issues that have kept Minnesota's talent base maybe at a lower level than it should be, all else being equal. But one thing he's done is he's gotten his teams to play hard and to play aggressively and to play with some toughness. And that does matter. And I think, the guards are better. For sure, that's a factor. Garcia and Payne have been better. Ole Joseph has been improved. All those things are true, but part of the reason those things, those areas, those players are showing up as better is because of the way that Minnesota plays, in my opinion. And if you watch that game against Northwestern, and you've seen Northwestern at all this year, you know that that's what Northwestern does. Northwestern plays with physicality. They play extremely hard. They keep coming at you for 40 minutes. And so to beat them, you got to be able to match that. And Minnesota did, and then some yesterday. And I think that had a lot to do with why they won. So you got to give Ben Johnson a lot of credit. For them to be sitting at 5-5 is remarkable. I mean, if you told me that they won 5 games for the season instead of at the halfway point in the league, I would have believed that. I mean,
I thought that's actually pretty good.
By the way, same thing for Penn State. Penn State, very different kind of team. But Mike Rose, man, I give that guy all kinds of credit. He's got them at 5-6. No way did I think that team with a completely different roster was going to win 5 games on the season. And here they are just over halfway in, and they're already sitting there. So both of those teams and their coaches really deserve a lot of credit. So that spiel over, turning back to what Minnesota actually is, it's basically the things that have to do with playing big that they do well offensively. They're good from 2, as a team with a couple of legit post threats probably should be. And they're a solid, not a great offensive rebounding team, but they're solid. Everything else, they kind of struggle. They're not a great deep shooting team at all. They have some guys that can hit a shot occasionally, as we saw in the game at Breslin, but they're not a great shooting team from out there. They really struggle with turnovers. So, when we say that their backcourt is much improved, despite the 2 things I've just said, in part, that's a statement as to just how catastrophically awful their guard play was last year. More than, oh my God, they've got all Big Ten guys this year, but it is better. And that's kind of it. defensively, it's funny. They were ranked 90th in Ken Palm adjusted defensive efficiency.
Say that three times fast.
When Michigan State saw them the last time. So counting the Michigan State game, they played 4 games since then. They're up to 58. But it's not like they've just shut people down. They played well, but what's helped is they played good opponents. They played Michigan State, they played Wisconsin, they played Northwestern over that stretch.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to help you. That's where the adjusted part comes in, right? You play better opponents and you do a good job. Yeah, you get more credit than if you're doing it against, Rutgers. So they are better there. I think that, again, size helps. They show up inside the arc and they show up with some shot blocking, some rim protection. And so those things help them, at least get to a point that you view them as a competent defense, not a great one, but competent. So, and as you said at the outset, hey, it's a road game in the Big Ten, man. You've got to come in with the mentality that whatever it takes to find a way to get a win, style points are out the window. And that's the scenario that's waiting for Michigan State on Tuesday night. I would imagine that they're still not drawing. I mean, if you watch that Northwestern game and the occasional times that the camera turned to the upper deck, it was pretty empty. So sure. We're not talking about Minnesota crowds the way it was when they had, their Final Four team in the mid-90s. We're not back to that yet. But I do think it's going to be. We heard Coach Mike Garland a few episodes ago talk about how tough a building that place can be, Williams Arena, and I expect that it's going to be a tough environment for Michigan State. So it'll definitely. This game certainly ranks as a challenge and more challenging than it looked like on the schedule in October for sure.
Yeah. Well, Michigan State's a big draw and Northwestern isn't. Even though Northwestern is a much improved team, people just aren't going to show up for that game. Doesn't mean that Williams Arena is going to be packed because they've been a poor team for a long time. And it harkens back, I think, you and I remember victories kind of few and far between in Minneapolis for a long time. It's just a hard place to play, and it just hasn't been recently because they haven't been good. I mean, for a long time, and so it's been easier getting wins there.
Yeah, and that's a very fair comment. We talk about, and that was another thing Coach Garland said that I thought was interesting when we were talking about Cole in Madison, and his comment was that it's okay, but it's not one of the tougher environments to play in because of the way it's built, the fact the fans aren't directly on top of you, all of those things. So what the subtext there was, look, the record over the years in that building has more to do with how good those teams have been than it does the environment per se. And I think, for as much as everybody talks about Mackey Arena, the most important part of the Mackey Arena equation is that Purdue's generally pretty good. Assembly Hall for a good portion of my life was just an almost impossible place to think you were going to get a win at. Why? Because Indiana was really good generally. They haven't been really good over the last 20 years, give or take, but nowhere near what they were, say, the 30 years prior to that. And all of a sudden, it's a little easier place to get a win at. Ask Penn State yesterday. So it's a very fair point. But I do think, in addition to that truth, there also is something about certain environments. And Minnesota is one that if the crowd gets going, it can be tough.
Yeah, there's no question that those make a difference. But it's like anything, it's on the margins, it's worth a point or two maybe.
Right.
Which is, if you look at betting odds, usually home Just like home field's worth something, and football, it's worth a few points in basketball as well.
Generally, I want to say that and I could be wrong about this, but I think, I'm not a gambler, but I think the generally accepted wisdom is that Vegas assigns, depending on the team, obviously there's little variance, but usually 3 to 4 points.
Yeah, right.
For home court. So it's real.
Yeah. Yeah, and the only other thing I would say is about Ben Johnson and the toughness. It is hard when you have attributes that are real. I mean, we know they're real. Whether a team can close out a game, there's no question there are teams that are better at that and not. We've seen that at Michigan State. There are teams that get rattled and teams that don't. There's no analytics that shows you that, except vaguely. Well, they're offensive efficiency, defensive efficiency, but there are certain teams when they're up 2 with a minute and a half left, you're much more comfortable with than other teams, right? I mean, you feel more confident that they're going to close the game. And there's no statistical thing you can talk about that. And so for the same reason that sort of the toughness and how hard someone plays is absolutely a real thing, but I don't know how you could capture that. There's no monitor or way of sort of...
There have been attempts to define clutch play, but it's, I think it's I'm with you. I think it's a very difficult thing to measure in a way that feels truly satisfying. It's one of these things that, again, it causes a lot of analytics people conniption fits, because and there's truth to it, in the sense that a basket counts for 2 or 3 points, regardless of what time in the game it's made.
Right. Exactly.
So when you view it that way, absolutely, there's an importance to all 40 minutes. And because we're human beings, we tend to lock in on the last, 60 seconds as being more critical. But admitting the truth of that, if you've ever played a sport, particularly any sport where a game is coming to its conclusion, so bottom of the ninth, 2 outs in baseball, or the clock's running out in the other major team sports, if you've played in those situations, it's not something that we're making up. It's real. You feel in a close situation, you feel additional pressure. It exists. And it exists and it's real because it exists and it's real in the minds of everybody who's on that court in this case, right? That makes it real. And it's real because they know that regardless of what's happened in the previous 39 minutes, if it's a tight game, that last minute is where it gets decided. Yep. And there are people who are better able to function in those moments than others. It's interesting on that point. I watched an extended post-game conversation with Malik Hall after yesterday's game. And it's not like Malik has stepped up, and I can think of one big clutch moment. I'm probably missing some, but I remember him as a freshman hitting a huge 3 in a win at Seton Hall that was pretty big. But he's not necessarily a guy you would look at as, okay, that's the clutch guy. In fact, the plays don't tend to find him in those moments. On this team, it tends to be Tyson Walker, who's had some good moments and had some failures. It's been a little of both. But Malik was talking about his focus always being staying even keeled, and how sometimes that's created an issue for he and Tom Izzo, because Izzo wants him to be fiery, as he wants all his players to be. And that's not how Malik is wired. And Malik's instinct is to go the other way and not get too high, not get too low. And most of the time, when I was thinking that yesterday, when you watched him score some of those big buckets, when he went on that run to sort of close out Maryland, you didn't see him yelling, fist pumping. He didn't do that stuff. Sometimes it's funny because what it illustrates is that there is very much no one size fits all, right?
Correct.
There's a school of thought that would say, well, you want somebody like that in pressure situations, because they're not going to get rattled by the moment. I think of somebody like Jared Goff, the Lions, has that kind of demeanor, and that's something his teammates talk about. He never gets too high, never gets too low, and so you can see where that kind of player could breed confidence, right? But on the other hand, I've seen enough guys at Michigan State make huge plays who are anything but calm and collected. They're fiery, they're expressive. So it's funny. Who's going to be a player that excels in those moments? There's not one pure formula that always tells you that, gives you that conclusion. But again, you know it when you see it. I know at Michigan State, I always felt in a tight situation, there are two guys I can think of that I always felt great about. Mateen Cleaves and Kalen Lucas. And why do I say that? It's because they put a lot of pelts on their wall, so to speak, by winning games, by making big plays and big moments. It happened a lot. Is that a fluke? I don't think so. I think they were kind of wired for it.
Yeah. Some people embrace those moments.
Yeah.
And to your point, that the even keel is, in some ways, especially like a sport, I'm thinking like golf especially, is one where you don't really ever want to get too up or down because it's just going to throw you off. So, so it is interesting how those things work out and the way that it evolves. And so you may think you know what someone is, and then they change. And one good example of that I think somewhat recently is Aaron Henry really changed the way he was as a player. Really, I want to say the last half or last third of that his senior year, where he suddenly just became kind of a beast and just really emotionally got more involved. So, whatever people are now, they may be different by the end of the season too. You just don't know.
Well, that's one of the reasons why, as we get thoroughly into the back half of Malik Hall's fifth year, Tom Izzo is still trying to get him to be more expressive, to be more emotional. He believes that matters,
Yeah.
And I think it's because obviously he's seen that happen. He's had guys who weren't very expressive early on develop that part of their mentality,
Yeah. He also sees people in practice, and he may see moments where Malik is more aggressive and more emotional. And then he's like, yeah, he's playing better, and he, plays more intensity or whatever it is, gives him that it.
Absolutely.
So he's, so he probably says, we just need to see more of that. And that's maybe something. Sometimes you don't have as much insight into who you are as you think you do. And sometimes you have more.
Yeah.
So it just kind of has to play itself out. Well, let's talk about the starters, which and the rest of the lineup for Minnesota, brought to you by the brothers of Just Two Gutters, for the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. As you may know, we're getting closer to spring. It's actually sunny outside today. We must have gotten finally the doldrums of January, and it means that spring is on the way, which means rain's coming. So you want to make sure your gutters are well taken care of. The brothers of Just Two Gutters do fantastic work. It's all they do is just gutters, downspouts, all those things. And I was trying to think of the term, there's I think it's like tiling. Are those the tubes that go out and into your gutters out into your yard? So that makes sure that even when the water comes down, it pools and stays away from the side of your house. And they do that too. So they will repair, replace, clean them out. They'll add leaf guards, whatever you need done. They even heaters for your gutters so you don't have all kinds of ice and snow build up on your gutters if you don't want that. They can also do commercial jobs. And so you get 10% off, you mentioned Final Four, when you get your estimates, whether you're on the west side of the state with Kurt and his team or on the east side of the state in the Metro Detroit area with Greg and his team. The Brothers Suggest You Gutter should be your first call for taking care of your gutter work. We'll get through this, and once we get through the lineup, Rod will give us who Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. So the starters, we'll start with Elijah Hawkins, who Michigan State did not play against the first meeting in East Lansing. 5'11 junior, transferred from Howard, averaging 8.8 points a game on 39, 37, and 79 shooting. But he's done a nice job running the offense, averaging 7.8 assists per game, and just a little under 3-to-1 assist-to-turnover ratio, so very good, and also leads the team in steals at about 2 a game.
Yeah, look, he's a good player, and his presence out there will definitely change the dynamic from the first game, because the first game, Minnesota really doesn't have a great second option at that position. So they had to play differently, but I honestly think some things in that game, that starting with the fact that it made Minnesota's backcourt significantly bigger without him. It changed some dynamics that ended up working out positively for them too. You can't just say, well, it was a pure negative that they didn't have him, and so that means they're going to be much, much better in this game. They'll be different for sure, and I think that they're a better team over the course of a season, clearly, with him than without him. What it's going to mean for this matchup, that remains to be seen. I was pulling for Minnesota to win yesterday.
Sure.
It helps Michigan State. Northwestern comes back to the pack, and in fact, they're now tied with Northwestern in the conference standing. So that's what I was pulling for. But Hawkins he's a tough guy to watch at times, because for all his numbers, which are really good, there are just decisions that he'll make at times that are just absolutely baffling. I mean, passing decisions on plays where he's trying to make plays. So situations where maybe he's getting too deep, which is something that, A.J. Hoggard and Tyson Walker struggled with for a while in their careers, just getting too deep in terms of penetration. So I certainly wouldn't say he's a boom-bust player, because his numbers tell you that that's not really the case. But I think his numbers suggest a little different player than he actually is. He is more of a risk taker than a typical guy with a ratio like he has would seem to be. As a scorer, not quite 9 points a game. So he's not somebody that looks to shoot a ton, but he's actually been a decent deep shooter. And this is a team that doesn't have a lot of that. So he can hurt you there too if you're not careful. But definitely going to change the dynamic at both ends, because he's also aggressive defensively. He's their steals leader. So as you said, he's definitely going to change the dynamic from what it was in the first game, and he's a key guy for them. There's no two ways about it.
Moving on to the next guard is Mike Mitchell, 6'2" junior transfer from Pepperdine, averaging 10.3 points a game on 43, 38, and 73 shooting. Leads the team in about 1.3 steals per game, and is a good assist guy with 61 assists and 40 turnovers. 14 points in the first matchup. He was 5 of 12 from the field, 3 for 9 from three. So I think he hit like his three of his first four, and then missed everything after that. So he was definitely like the streaky sort of thing, which is sort of your initial impression, and it didn't change by watching him play.
It hasn't changed. It's been that way all year. He's their best 3-point shooter in terms of a guy who shoots with a lot of volume. There's another guy that has a better percentage, but he's not the volume shooter Mitchell is. So he was a critical addition just based on that, because this is a team that had nothing from three last year. So to add him, been very important, but he is not a knockdown guy. You are talking about very much a streaky shooter. And so that's got positives and negatives, If he's on a roll, boy, it can be tough, as Michigan State found out early in that game, as you said. It can be tough to slow him down. But if he's on a bad run, it can stay there for a while. So he's not a guy that you look at and say, well, look, mark him down for 4 for 10 every night. That's just not the way it is. So that creates a problem, though, because if he's on a roll, if he's on a hot streak, well, then you got to deal with that. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, because he's got a pretty quick release. He has a good understanding of how to hunt shot opportunities, and his teammates have shown him an ability to find them. So that's challenging, but a good player, definitely. As I said, the deal with Minnesota's guards, it's not like they added guys who were all Big Ten material, but they're just so much better than what they had last year that it's making a big difference, even if they're flawed.
So moving to the wing, Cam Christie, 6'6" freshman wing, younger brother of former MSU player Max, who plays for the Lakers. Cam's averaging 10.7 points a game and 3.7 rebounds a game, shooting 44, 39, and 75. He's about half his attempts, or a little over half his attempts, are three-pointers. He had 8 points and he had a strange game that he hit a couple threes and looked good, but he fouled out. He only played 16 minutes. He was, though I describe him as soft. And also the other thing too is, compared to his brother Max, who I was surprised that he's made it in the NBA, because I know he's got some size, but he wasn't a very good shooter at Michigan State. Then I thought, well, maybe he's a better shooter than I remembered. I just was remembering all his misses, but he only shot 31% from three in his freshman year. And, his brother's here, but almost knocking on the doors of 40%. So, he's an upgrade over Max in that sense.
Well, Max had a weird year. Max's reputation was as an outstanding shooter. That's what he was supposed to be. And he did not ever find consistency in his year at Michigan State. But it is not surprising to me that he's managed to kind of get back on the shooting beam as a pro. I wasn't sure what his prospects were going to be, because after a year like the one he had at Michigan State, you don't know, like, well, okay, maybe he's not that level of shooter after all, but it's not, it shouldn't be too shocking that he's recovered, because that was his reputation all along. He just had a bad year. I think the big difference between them is that Max, if you remember, there would be times that you would see bursts of athleticism from him. There would be like wow moments, because you didn't always see them, but there were times that he showed that off. He was also really good defensively. I mean, as a freshman, Izzo was often using him as the matchup on the opposing team's best offensive wing. I don't see that from Cam. I haven't seen those elements from Cam. Basically, what Cam has done is give them a perimeter boost, and he's been very good at that, and that's important for this team. But he's not the prospect. He's not the overall player that Max was. Max could also run an offense a little bit too, if you remember, and I don't see that from Cam. I think right now Cam is basically a taller wing shooter, and he's been very good in that role. And Minnesota has needed that. He was really good yesterday against Northwestern. He hit some big shots in that game. So he's a challenge too. When you add up these three guys, for a team that's not great shooting the three overall, these three starters are all, high 30s kind of guys. So they can test you. And so that's something Michigan State's going to have to be cognizant of. So all three are capable of hurting you.
Next would be Farrell Payne, a 6'10", 250-pound sophomore, averaging a little under 10 points a game and 6 rebounds a game, shooting 63% from the floor, but a miserable 39% from the line. He's a guy who is definitely a load. Yeah. And he's a little under two blocks a game. And he just plays really well. And he had 14-9 against Northwestern the other night.
Yeah. He's another guy. Oh, Cam Christie played really well in that win yesterday. Good player. Definitely. And a guy that I mentioned it last year in the disaster that was Minnesota's season a year ago. He was one of the very few bright spots, because I thought it was pretty obvious that he was a kid that if they were going to be able to keep him, which is always the issue in the modern game, but if they can keep him, that's a guy who by the time he's a junior or senior, you could see being on some level of all Big Ten team, maybe not first team, but he had all the tools. He's obviously, as you said, physically he's a load, but he's also not a half bad athlete for a big man. He can move, And so he gives you rim protection on defense. He can rebound because he takes up a lot of space and he's strong. Offensively, he's got it's not a ultra sophisticated post game, but he can score in the post, and he's a threat on putbacks. He's tough to handle, and he presents a lot of challenges. Now, it's interesting. Recently, Minnesota, and it might have started, I don't know, but it might have started in the Michigan State game, because that game, Minnesota opted, in the absence of Hawkins, they opted to go big, and they started both Payne and Garcia, and they've been doing that a lot since then with decent results. So, it creates a problem. Now, the downside is you're not getting much of a stretch element, because Payne doesn't shoot threes at all. And Garcia, although he's been a little better lately, is still well under 30% on the year. So you can make the argument that, that clogs up your offense when you don't have four guys. You can't play 4 out, 1 in. But the flip side of it is, Minnesota's got some strengths offensively, which we've talked about. They score well inside the arc. Well, that's in part their big men, and they can offensive rebound a little bit. That's also their big men. So Payne helps you in both of those areas. But he's one of those guys too. When I talk about Ben Johnson getting his team to play hard with some force, some toughness, Payne is one of the guys I'm talking about.
And then finally, Dawson Garcia, 6'11", 230-pound junior, played at Marquette, played at North Carolina, is now back for a second year in Minneapolis, leading the team at 17.7 points a game and rebounding at 6.8 a game, shooting 45, 26, and 82 on the year. And he was definitely their best player in the game in East Lansing. He went for 22 and 9, but he did have a bunch of turnovers, and he's good from the line too, averaging almost 7 free throws a game.
Yeah, he's a tough cover, and he's having a really nice year. The 3-point shooting, as I mentioned a second ago, it still looks bad, but he was, over the last 4 games, he's raised it by 5%. He was at 21% coming into the MSU game, and now he's sitting at 26. So that means he's found some level of production recently. He's a tough cover because he's big enough that he can do damage around the rim, but he also does have a face-up game, and even if he's not hitting the 3 well, he can still hit mid-range 2s. He's capable there, and he's also a good enough handler that he can face you up and look to go by you, to go to the rim, which is part of that element, is part of what helps him get all those free throw attempts. So he's a very tough cover, and he's been a very effective player overall for them. As you said, Michigan State had real problems containing him in that first game. It'll be interesting to see how this one goes. But he gives them, I felt coming into the season, it was important that they had him, because sometimes if you're a bottom end team, you don't have even that one player who could be a difference maker on certain nights. And I felt like he at least gave them that. Well, obviously the rest of their team has been better around him, but that part still holds true. Garcia gives them a guy that on a given night could go for 25 or 30 and kind of carry them. And not every team has that kind of player. So that's an edge for Minnesota to have that kind of weapon.
So moving on to the reserves, we'll start with Joshua Ola-Joseph, 6'7", 215-pound sophomore, averaging a little under 10 points a game and 2.7 rebounds a game, shooting 62, 41, and 75. He obviously started the Michigan State game because Hawkins was out. Only averages about 1.5 threes a game, so even though he shoots 41%, it's pretty low volume. But he's not been doing well recently, right? He's like 0 for 5 in the last 4 games.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We had talked about that coming into the first game. Wow, this guy's got eye-popping shooting numbers, but the volume's not huge, and you wonder how sustainable that is. Well, I think we're maybe finding out that he's probably not a 50% shooter from three. And he's been on a cold streak. Now, if you're Michigan State, then you got to worry about is, wow, guy who's been on a cold streak at home, is he going to suddenly find himself against us? You never know. But what's weird is that his playing time, for a guy who started most of the year, lately his playing time has really fluctuated. He only played 8 minutes yesterday against Northwestern.
An overtime game. That's strange.
Right, in a 45-minute game. That's a good point. So even worse. So I don't know what's going on there, other than I think that Ben Johnson really likes what the Payne and Garcia combination has been giving him, when they're out there together, and then surround them with three guards. I think he's felt like that's worked, but Ola Joseph is a guy who has definitely done some damage this year. He's played a lot of good basketball. He's averaging double digits still. So definitely a guy who's dangerous. He obviously is a threat from three, even with the recent cold streak. And yet he's got enough physicality that he can do some damage inside the arc too. So he's a guy you got to be cognizant of.
Then move on to Braden Carrington, 6'4", sophomore wing, averaging 4.9 points a game on 35, 16, and 72 shooting. So obviously he made a three against Michigan State.
Yeah, exactly.
He grabs 3.8 rebounds per game in 23 minutes.
Yeah, and another, bigger-bodied physical wing helps. Clearly not a great shooter, although, as you say, he did stick one against MSU. I think he was one for two. Yeah. So we'll hope that doesn't repeat itself. But this is a team that it's a slightly less extreme version of Ben Johnson's first team in Minnesota. They don't go very deep. So every guy that can give you at least competent minutes off that bench helps, because it's going to mean that those starters are at least a little bit fresher. And that's the primary role this kid serves.
Parker Fox is finally healthy. He's averaging 3.7 points a game and 2.5 rebounds a game in 11 minutes, shooting 71% from the floor, 48% from the line, 0 for 3 from the deep for the season. And he's the one who transferred up, and he got injured. So it's kind of amazing that he's back and playing.
Yeah, we talked about this before the first game. I think that's the victory for him and the next guy we'll talk about. Just after both of them missed 2 straight years with injuries. So after that, just getting back out on the floor and playing is a victory. And he's given them some production. Again, Minnesota is primarily a 7-man rotation, and there's a couple guys, Fox is one of them, who play, might get one quick turn each half, and that's kind of it. But he's another big body, which helps. That they can roll out another guy who at least has some legitimate size, can go get you a rebound and a bucket now and then. He hasn't done anything spectacular, except that the shooting percentage from the floor tells you, if anything, this is a guy who understands exactly who he is. He's not taking a lot of shots that he can't make.
Right. Finally, Isaiah Ennen, the other person you're talking about who's out 2 years with injury, is 6'9", junior. And he's averaging 4.3 points a game and 2.5 rebounds a game in 15 minutes, shooting 45, 37, and 50. And he played just 60 minutes, actually, but had sort of a bunch of zeros across the board, except a couple of rebounds.
Yeah, and the reason I talk about that shrinking bench is lately he's played less than his seasonal averages.
Sure.
But again, he's shot well enough that it gives him a role that he can fill on this team. They can bring him in for a few minutes on the wing and maybe get a bucket out of him, get a little bit of production, hold the fort down. But again, the biggest thing I think here is that he's playing it all.
And the Brothers Adjust Gutter sponsored player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. The first matchup, it was Dawson Garcia. I imagine even though the return of Hawkins, it's still Garcia. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, he's just been so productive, and he really did a number on Michigan State in the game in East Lansing. So he's the obvious choice, I think.
So I think this will be a little more interesting now. We've got the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, player that Michigan State, who cleans the glass the best. Currently, you have a 4.5 edge on me. I get to pick first this time, and it's a little harder. I think it was pretty obvious. It was pretty much just Hall and Mahdi, and pretty much Mahdi for a while. And now we have had a lot of emergence of other people rebounding the ball. We've had, Akins and Hall and Cooper and Sissoko. So I think it's a lot trickier. So I'm going to not go with Mahdi since I get to pick first this time, which maybe I'm sure I'll regret immediately. But I'm going to go with Cooper just because he was there last. And I think, we'll see if he picks it up and rebounds the road well. I don't know. Who are you going to go with?
I'm going to go with Mahdi Sissoko. I think that he will bounce back after, it was an interesting game against Maryland because he didn't rack up a lot of rebounds, but I thought his activity level was good and it helped other guys maybe, which sometimes happens in rebounding. You can do an effective job and not be the guy who's actually getting credited with the rebound because you took out your guy. And I think that was something of the case at times in the Maryland game. So I'm gonna pick him to bounce back and lead Michigan State on the boards in this game.
We say that all in the shadow of the last meeting where Malik Hall had 12 rebounds.
Right.
Easily ran away with it. So we'll see. I mean, I think obviously anything is possible in this game. And a game that Michigan State needs to do a good job on the boards. But if you need your windows cleaned, your glass cleaned, there's no better place to reach out to than the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You can find the contact information on our support page at thefinalfoursnottheschedule.com/support. There you can get a link to get an estimate from them, 15% off if you mention rebound with getting your estimate. They do fantastic work. Clean your windows, clean the side of your house. They power wash. They do all those sorts of things. Get your screens. And I don't know. Our experience was fantastic. They were super professional, very, very nice young men who came to our house and were so thorough. I mean, I can't recommend them enough. And not only your house, you can have them come by your business. They do high rises. They've done the state capitol. They've sort of been around and done all the jobs. And so whatever the job is, it's not too small, not too big for them. They can handle it. So again, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. Then we'll go on to our 5 keys of the game brought to you by Nudge Printing. This time we're just going to have a little brief word with Gabe. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Gabe Viscomi, owner of the fantastic sponsor of the Final Four on the schedule, Nudge Printing. We're here to take a peek behind the curtain. And Gabe, you've been in the business for a while now. What is the favorite part of the business for you?
We will get quite a few people reaching out to us, just like telling us how much they like the product and how it fits and whatnot. And that's always the best part because, for us, we sell a lot of apparel, a lot of car decals, and it goes out into the world and you never think about it again. So I love it when, people will post on Twitter or whatever and say like, hey, I got my new hoodie. And I love it. Like that type of thing is like, oh my gosh, you hear from,
Well, and I can tell you personally, I love all the stuff. I mean, all the shirts and hoodies we've had are just, they're super comfortable. I mean, that alone makes it well worth it. So, and they're very durable. So we've been very pleased with ours as well.
Well, thank you.
All right. So the 5 keys of the game, we'll begin with number 1, interior defense. As you mentioned before, now they're going the 2 bigs with Payne and Garcia, just like they did against Michigan State in the first meeting. They do a lot of stuff around the rim. So Michigan State's going to it's a new sort of a challenge, obviously, and the way different than the other teams have been playing.
Yeah, very, very much so. This is a team you got to, again, particularly the way that Minnesota is using those guys together a lot. That's the challenge you're going to be faced with. And it creates some matchup issues too, because what it means is that you probably are going to see a lot of Malik Hall guarding Dawson Garcia. And that's a challenging matchup for Malik because Garcia's got the kind of mobility that, normally Malik would be guarding that kind of player and you'd feel good about that. And you do here. I mean, he's capable of guarding Garcia away from the rim effectively. But Garcia's also got like 3 inches on Malik.
Yeah.
So it's a tough cover. And then your bigs are dealing with Payne, who, as we talked about, is a load physically. and can carve out space around the rim, and he's a problem. So it's a challenge here. And, in the first game, I think Payne I want to say he had 9 points, maybe.
Yeah,
so
7. Mm-hmm.
7.
Yeah.
Okay. So combined, those two guys had 29 points between those two bigs. That's good production. And so Michigan State's going to want to try to find ways to limit that a little bit more in this game. Easier said than done, but I think what will go a long way is some of what we saw in the game yesterday against Maryland, where you see guys really, really competing, playing hard, playing aggressively, and playing with toughness. That's going to be some of what's going to be required. Absolutely.
Second key to the game is pace, and just mention this every time. Michigan State actually played pretty well with pace against Minnesota in the first matchup. And so, again, they want to try and get into the offense quickly. Obviously, fast breaks when possible, but you just want a good movement and getting a shot up sooner rather than later.
And I will say this, compared to what we talked about this in the post game yesterday about Maryland, Minnesota is not Maryland. They're not that level of team defensively. So in the half court, you should be able to play quicker, I think. And they did in the first matchup, and I think they should be able to again in this one. Michigan State, in terms of being able to get into transition in the last game, had 17 fast break points in the first meeting, which is good. Some of that was the result of turnovers. And you do have to acknowledge Minnesota was playing without their starting point guard. So this might be a different dynamic. You might not be. That said, Minnesota has been a terrible turnover team, just plagued with them, even with Hawkins. So there may still be the opportunities to get out on the break as a result of live ball turnovers, So we'll see how that evolves, but I do think the odds for Michigan State to be able to play as fast as they want to, or closer to that at least, are pretty good as opposed to that last game against Maryland.
The next key to the game is energy and toughness, and I don't recall what Minnesota's Ken Palm ranking is for energy and toughness, but they're a pretty tough team.
Yeah, as we're talking about, I mean, you could say, well, that stuff's a cliche, blah, blah, blah. I don't believe that. I think that it does show up as not necessarily always but as a underlying cause in some of the areas that we can measure. So rebounding, defense, even offense, it shows up. How effective is your screening game? Are guys playing through contact and able to convert some and ones? Are you playing aggressively enough to draw fouls at all? All of those things. And Minnesota at home, look, if you're Ben Johnson, they say, well, we're 5-5 now. They're not on course for a tournament bid. I think that's a long shot, and Long just left town. But you're trying to build something, You're trying to build a program. You're trying to do some things that will convince players you're recruiting to come there and improve your talent base. And so if you're in that situation, you just beat Northwestern, the team everybody's been fawning over. Now you get Michigan State coming in, a team that, what is MSU? 5 of their last 6, 6 of their last 7, something like that.
Something like that.
Five of their last 6, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's another big opportunity. So I would expect that he's going to have his team revved up. MSU's got to match that at least.
And then boards. Minnesota, decent rebounding team, okay offensively, better than they are defensively, but probably on both numbers. I don't know. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm guessing they're probably ranked ahead of Michigan State in both those categories.
They are.
Yeah.
A little bit. And in the first game, it was a slight edge. I think Minnesota had a 3% edge. It was something like 34% offensive rebounding rate to 31%. So it was an edge, but it wasn't a decisive one. Michigan State needs to keep it in that range. This is a game coming in that you would think you'll have an advantage in turnovers. So if that holds, then you just need to be somewhere around even on the boards. And again, Minnesota's going to play big. They're going to play hard with some physicality and some energy. You got to find ways to combat that. But in the first game, Michigan State did okay in that area. They need to repeat that. And I think one sign of MSU having a shot at doing that is some of what we saw in that Maryland game. We didn't really spend a lot of time talking about this aspect in particular, but Michigan State's guards rebounded better. Yep. I want to say AJ had 5 and Akins had 6, right?
Akins had 5 and AJ had
5.
4.
But 5 and 4.
Akins had a cup 3 offensive, and AJ had an offensive rebound. He has like a putback.
Yep. And so those things are obviously important. We've been talking about it frequently, that Michigan State's rebounding will go as their perimeter group goes. And so those guys need to keep making that level of contribution, and that matters in this game too.
Yeah, what's interesting about that game in East Lansing before is that although Michigan State actually had more offensive rebounds, they had 12 to Minnesota's 10, but State had 16 more field goal attempts.
Yeah.
So that's why the percentage-wise, just goes to show the difference in the turnover margin. Was
absolutely
too,
it was very big, and I don't expect it to be that big this time. I do think Michigan State probably should have an edge, though. And so if that's true, then it just means if you play them to a draw on the glass, that's good, because that should leave you with an advantage in scoring opportunities, and that's what you want.
And the final key to the game is the road.
MSU found a way to beat Maryland at Maryland a couple weeks back, and that's great. That was a breakthrough. It was their first true road win of the year. And then they went to Madison and really didn't play particularly well and got beat, by double digits. So you can't yet say that the road issues have been fully exercised, right? Mm-hmm. This is another opportunity, and this is an opportunity with a game that when you look at it on paper is very much a winnable game. Michigan State will be favored, I imagine. I haven't seen a line yet, but I would imagine there'll be a fairly narrow favorite. I would think probably, 2 points, 3 points, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it's a game that if they play well, they likely will win. But you have to do that. And so this is another opportunity, and it matters because for Michigan's, we've been talking for a while, a lot of people, they were talking about it on the broadcast yesterday. Michigan State's schedule sets up in a way that they could really go on a run here late in the season. And I think that's true on balance, but you still got to acknowledge, you're still going to these places, and you got to go to Ann Arbor. Yeah, they're terrible, but it's still a road game. You got to go to Penn State, I believe. Yep. You gotta go to Minnesota in this one. I'm not sure where else.
Indiana.
Okay, there's another one. Yeah, all of those games look very winnable, but when you're on the road, it takes a different kind of mentality and a different kind of performance, usually, in order to be able to get a win, no matter how bad the opponent is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is an example of that. Look, and also I think sometimes people, especially those who don't follow real closely, they tend to lock in the preseason perception, and that sort of drives how they see it, regardless of what's changed.
Right.
The reality is, I said this yesterday on the Spartan Mag board, I think it's fair to say that the Big Ten is not particularly deep in tournament quality teams. We've talked about this recently. Probably 6 bids is what I think we're looking at, absent something weird happening. And that's not normal. The Big Ten in a 14-team league now you would say, 8 is kind of where your threshold starts. So they don't have that quality at the top. But I also think the league is a little deeper in, capable teams than we thought.
Teams.
Yeah. Really, there's only 2 teams that I think are bad, because I'm not quite, Ohio State is just been this eternal conundrum. Despite their record, I'm not quite ready to put them in the bad team category. I think Michigan or Rutgers is really where it stops. And everybody else, I think, on a given night is capable of winning a game. You got Penn State at 5-6. You have Minnesota at 5-5. Well, those were 2 very popular picks for 13th and 14th. In fact, I think that's what we did. And they're not going to finish. They're not going to finish 13th and 14th,
Nowhere close, yeah.
Iowa, they're not great, but they're capable on a given night. Indiana really, really looks awful at times. They've won 5 games in the league already. So,
Right.
you go through that list of teams in that range that we're talking about, and they're capable. They've obviously figured out ways to win a decent number of games. So this is not a gimme. Michigan State's got to play well. This is not Minnesota of last year. It's a different deal. And MSU is going to have to play well in order to win, and that's hard to do in a road environment. But I also think that they are fully capable of doing that, and push comes to shove, I expect them to.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, looking at the class of coaches that came in. There's Johnson, Shrewsbury, and Woodson all came at the same time. And it's funny how your impression changes based on the year, too. I think, first year we thought, we were impressed with Shrewsbury. We were impressed with Johnson. Year 2, we're like, Johnson's like, I don't know. It was a pretty bad year. And Shrewsbury bolts, and they obviously had a lot of success. He ended up going to Notre Dame, but they took his team to the tournament. And Woodson was like, maybe not. And then this year, it seems pretty clear that Woodson is maybe finding the door, and Johnson looks like he's kind of regained his footing, and he may be in there for the long haul. I mean, depends on next year, I think.
I got to tell you, I think that beating Northwestern yesterday, I'm not going to say that cements it, but I'm going to be very surprised, because I don't think they're done winning games either.
Right. I agree.
I'd be shocked if Ben Johnson doesn't get another year. I think he's done enough with this team. And a lot of those guys can be back too. The transfers he added were not grad transfers. They weren't 1-year guys. So even Garcia, I believe, has another year left. He wants it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that team could be back for more or less intact. It's interesting, just to digress for a second. You mentioned Mike Woodson. There is a distinct possibility, and I'm going to predict that it is not a clean sweep. Not all 3 of these guys will be gone next year, but right now, when you look at it, there is a distinct possibility that the jobs at Indiana, Ohio State, and Michigan could all open up.
Yeah.
And that is, I said this on the Spartan Mag board. Again, I'm referencing that, but I said that this morning. I said the fascinating thing about coaching searches is it really tells you what the perception is of your program among coaches, which is a very different thing sometimes than how fans or media sees it. So when you look at these jobs, I think the Michigan job is a tough one to peg, because it's got some attractive elements, but it also has some real issues, serious issues. So I don't think it's on the level of the other 2. But man, if you're talking about resources, in both financial, counting them all, financial resources, facilities, and the ability to recruit easily to your school, Ohio State and Indiana are top tier jobs.
For sure. Yeah.
But particularly at Indiana, that job also comes with a lot of pressure. And so that's why, in Indiana's case, there's a lot of speculation that Dusty May, the current head coach of Florida Atlantic, who was a manager at Indiana when he was a student there, that he's the guy they want. They're going to get rid of Woodson and bring him in. And maybe that happens, because I do agree Dusty May's got to go this year. It may never get better in terms of an opportunity for him to go high major than it will this offseason. But maybe he doesn't. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows for sure. How does he view it? Yes, he's an alum. That certainly helps. But there's a world where someone could look at the Indiana and Ohio State jobs and think Ohio State's the better gig, because it's got all the same resources available to win with without nearly as much pressure, So I think it's going to be really interesting if that happens and those jobs are open, to see how it goes. We've got some weeks to go before we start finding out.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, we're going to leave it there. If you've not yet subscribed to the show, what's stopping you? Go ahead and subscribe. You can check us out on YouTube as well, especially when you have the interviews with other people like Coach Garland, that you can get some video and see our beautiful smiling faces. You can just find that at TFFINOTS. You can also go to our support page. Not only can you find links to our great sponsors to the show, if you want to get an estimate from Brothers Just Gutters or the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, or link to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. And don't forget, you get 20% off if you type in Final Four as one word at the checkout. You can also find ways to supporting the show financially if you'd like to do that, either a one-time or a recurring basis. That's always at the finalfoursontheschedule.com/support. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.